The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden glow over the ancient stone walls of the castle courtyard. Lady Elira stood by the fountain, her delicate fingers tracing the cool water as it rippled in the evening light. Her heart, though bound by duty and aristocratic tradition, longed for something she could not name. Every day she felt the weight of her family's expectations pressing down on her, a marriage to a man of power, a life devoted to preserving their lineage. And yet, beneath her graceful exterior, she yearned for a freedom she had never tasted. As she stood there, lost in thought, a shadow moved beneath the stone archways. Sir Kaelen, a knight of the crown, emerged from the shade, his armor gleaming in the fading light. He had just returned from the battlefield, his heart heavy with the burdens of war, but his gaze softened as it fell upon Lady Elira. He had seen her many times before, a fleeting presence in the castle, always distant and untouchable. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, he could feel the invisible thread pulling them together. Their eyes met, and in that single moment, time seemed to stop. The noise of the bustling courtyard faded away, leaving only the sound of their hearts pounding in unison. Elira felt a shiver run down her spine, as if the air itself had shifted. She had always been taught that knights were instruments of the crown, bound by duty, honor, and loyalty to the king. They were not meant to be objects of affection for noble women. But as she gazed into Kaelen's eyes, she saw something that went beyond his title, a depth, a longing, a kindred spirit. Kaelen approached, his steps slow and measured. He bowed his head slightly, his voice low and respectful. "My lady," he murmured, "the evening is fair, though it pales in comparison to your presence." Elira smiled faintly, her heart fluttering at his words. "Sir Kaelen," she replied, "I believe we have crossed paths before, though we have never truly spoken." The knight nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "Indeed, my lady. Fate, it seems, has a way of keeping us apart." For a moment, neither of them spoke, as if they were both afraid to disturb the fragile connection that had formed between them. But the tension in the air was undeniable, an unspoken understanding that something was happening, something neither of them had expected. And yet, even as they stood together, the world around them continued to move, the demands of their respective lives pulling them in opposite directions. Just as Elira opened her mouth to speak again, the clanging of the castle bell shattered the moment. A summons for the knights, a call to arms. Kaelen's expression hardened, the weight of his duty falling upon him like a heavy cloak. He glanced toward the bell tower, then back at Elira, his eyes filled with regret. "I must go," he said, his voice strained. "War calls, and I am bound to serve." Elira felt a pang of sorrow in her chest, though she barely knew him. "Be careful, Sir Kaelen," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Return to us safely." Kaelen bowed once more, but before he turned to leave, he reached for her hand, his touch warm and gentle against her skin. He pressed his lips softly to her fingers, a silent promise passing between them. And then, without another word, he was gone, disappearing into the night like a shadow. Elira stood there, her heart racing, her mind swirling with thoughts of the knight who had just walked away. She had never believed in love at first sight, nor had she ever considered defying her family's wishes. But now, standing alone in the courtyard, she felt something shift within her, a spark that would not be so easily extinguished. As the night settled over the castle, Elira knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, secrecy, and sacrifice. But no matter what lay ahead, she could not deny the truth that had taken root in her heart. Their love, though forbidden, was real. And nothing, not war, not duty, Not even the weight of her family's expectations could change that. Days turned into weeks, and Sir Kaelen was gone, his place on the battlefield far from the castle walls that now felt empty to Lady Elira. Each passing moment felt like a slow torment, the silence of her chambers weighing heavy on her heart. The only thing that kept her hope alive were the secret letters they exchanged, letters that had to be smuggled past the watchful eyes of her family and the ever-present castle guards. Every night, beneath the cover of darkness, Elira would sit by the small candlelight in her room, reading Kaelen's words, which were filled with longing and an aching desire to return to her. His descriptions of the battlefield were brief, but the depth of his emotions filled the parchment. He wrote of the cold, of the constant threat of death, and yet, through it all, his thoughts remained anchored to her. "My dearest Elira," one letter began, "I count the days until I can once again stand beneath those stone arches with you. War is a cruel beast, but it pales in comparison to the agony of being apart from you. Know that every sword I lift, every enemy I face, I do so with the thought of returning to you alive." Elira's heart swelled with each word, her love for Kaelen growing with every secret letter. But the walls of the castle were closing in on her. Her family, unaware of the forbidden romance, had grown restless. Her father had begun to speak of a suitor, a man of great wealth and power from a neighboring kingdom. Count Adhemar was his name, a ruthless man who saw marriage to Elira not as an act of love, but as a political strategy. At first, Elira had dismissed the idea, confident that she could delay any discussions of marriage until Kaelen returned. But her father's insistence grew, as did Count Adhemar's interest. He had come to the castle twice in recent weeks, each time making it clear that he intended to claim her hand in marriage. The pressure weighed on her, the future she so desperately wanted slipping away as the walls of duty closed in. One evening, as the shadows stretched long across the courtyard, Elira received a letter from Kaelen. But this letter was different. The tone was darker, more urgent. The war had taken a turn, and the king had ordered his knights to prepare for a final, decisive battle. "Elira," the letter read, "the time has come for me to face what may be my greatest challenge yet. The enemy is fierce, and the battle ahead promises no mercy. But know this: if I survive, I will return for you, and I will not leave your side again. But if fate decides otherwise, I want you to know that my heart will always belong to you, even in death." Tears filled Elira's eyes as she read the letter over and over, her heart breaking at the thought of losing him. She could not bear the idea of living a life without him, of being forced into a loveless marriage with a man like Count Adhemar. But what could she do? She was trapped, bound by the expectations of her family and her status. That night, as the castle slept, Elira made a decision. She would not wait for fate to decide her future. She would take matters into her own hands. With trembling hands, she penned a letter to Kaelen, one filled with the fire of her love and the determination of her heart. "Kaelen," she wrote, "I cannot stand by and let others dictate my fate. I choose you, and only you. If the war does not take you from me, then I will find a way to be with you, no matter the cost. I will defy my family, my station, and even the king himself, if I must. Our love is worth the risk, and I will not be another pawn in the game of power and politics. We will be together whether in life or in death." She sealed the letter and slipped it into the hands of a trusted servant, who promised to deliver it to Kaelen before the battle. The weight of her decision settled over her like a heavy cloak, but there was no turning back. She had chosen her path, and now all she could do was wait. But as the days passed, the pressure from her family grew unbearable. Her father summoned her to his chambers, his voice stern and commanding. "Elira, it is time," he said, his eyes cold. "Count Adhemer has offered his hand, and you will accept. The arrangements will be made at once." Panic seized her heart. "Father, no," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I cannot. You will," he interrupted, his voice like steel. "Your duty is to this family. You are not a child anymore. You will do what is required of you." Elira felt her world collapsing around her. She had no choice. The wedding would be arranged, and soon she would be bound to a man she did not love, her heart forever chained to a knight who might never return. And so, with a heavy heart, Elira prepared to face the unthinkable, a marriage to Count Adhemer, while her soul remained with Kaelen on the battlefield. But as the day of the wedding approached, a shadow of hope remained, a small, desperate belief that Kaelen would return, that their love would defy the forces that sought to tear them apart. The stage was set. The battle was near. And the lovers were caught in a storm that would soon decide their fate. The day of the wedding arrived with an eerie calm. The castle was adorned in the finest silks and banners, preparations made for a grand ceremony. Count Adhemer, dressed in opulent robes, stood tall and proud, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of victory. He saw Elira not as a woman, but as a prize, a means to consolidate his power. For him, this was just another strategic move, another conquest. Elira, however, felt none of the joy or excitement that should have accompanied such an occasion. As she stood before the mirror in her chamber, dressed in a lavish gown of white and gold, her heart was a prisoner to a love that seemed just out of reach. Her mind wandered to Kaelen, to the battlefield where he fought, and to the letter she had sent him. She had received no reply, no word of his fate. Every moment of silence felt like a knife twisting deeper into her soul. The ceremony was only hours away, and the weight of her impending marriage pressed down on her like an iron shackle. As she looked out the window, across the courtyard where she had first met Kaelen, she could almost feel his presence, his touch, his gaze. She closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer, hoping against hope that somehow he would come for her. But war was cruel, and fate, it seemed, was merciless. The bells of the castle rang, signaling the start of the wedding. Elira's father entered her chambers, his face stern and unyielding. "It is time, Elira," he said. "Do not forget your duty." With a heavy heart, she nodded and allowed herself to be led to the grand hall where the ceremony would take place. The walk felt like a death march, each step taking her further away from the life she truly desired. As she entered the hall, the faces of nobles, lords, and ladies blurred together, their expressions indifferent to the turmoil raging within her. Count Adhemer stood at the altar, his eyes fixed on her with a predatory gleam. Elira's hands trembled as she approached, her body moving forward even as her soul cried out in protest. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat a reminder of the love she was about to lose forever. But just as the priest began to speak the words that would bind her to Adhemer, a loud commotion echoed through the hall. The grand doors burst open with a thunderous crash, and the air was suddenly filled with the sound of metal clashing against stone. Gasps and cries of alarm rippled through the crowd as a figure strode into the hall, bloodied but unbroken Sir Kaelen. His armor was battered and stained with the dust of battle, but his eyes burned with fierce determination. Elira's heart leapt at the sight of him, a wave of relief and joy crashing over her. He had come. Against all odds, he had returned. Kaelen's voice rang out, clear and defiant. "This wedding cannot proceed. Lady Elira's heart belongs to me, and I will not stand by and watch her be forced into a union she does not desire. Count Adamer's face twisted with rage, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. "How dare you, knight?" He spat. "You are nothing but a soldier. You think you can defy me, defy this kingdom?" Kaelen's gaze never wavered. "I defy no kingdom. But I will defy any man who seeks to claim what does not belong to him." His eyes locked onto Elira's, the intensity of his love shining through. "Elira, do you choose him? Or do you choose me?" The hall fell silent, all eyes on her. Elira's breath caught in her throat. This was the moment, the choice she had feared, but also longed for. Her mind raced, her heart torn between the duty she had been raised to uphold and the love she could no longer deny. But in that moment, standing before the two men who represented the different paths her life could take, the answer became clear. With trembling hands, Elira stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I choose love," she said, her eyes locked on Kaelen. "I choose you." The hall erupted into chaos. Count Adamer drew his sword, his face contorted with fury. "This is treason," he shouted. "I will not be humiliated in my own kingdom." But before he could take another step, Kaelen was upon him, their swords clashing with a deafening ring. The fight was swift and brutal, both men skilled in the art of combat, but Kaelen fought with the strength of a man who had everything to lose. His strikes were precise, his movements fluid. Adamer, blinded by his rage, faltered. With a final decisive blow, Kaelen disarmed Adamer, his sword clattering to the floor. He pressed his blade to Adamer's throat, his voice low and deadly. "You may be a man of power, but you will never know the strength of love." Adamer, his pride shattered, looked up at Kaelen with a mixture of fear and loathing. "You have won this day, knight," he hissed. "But the crown will not forget your defiance." Kaelen withdrew his sword, his gaze hard. "Let them come. I will face whatever consequences may come, but I will not live in regret." With that, Adamer stormed out of the hall, his wounded pride dragging behind him like a cloak. The nobles murmured in shock, unsure of what to do, but none dared challenge the knight who had just defied both tradition and power. Kaelen turned to Elira, his eyes softening as he approached her. He took her hands in his touch sending warmth through her cold, trembling fingers. "Elira," he whispered, "we are free now. But this choice, it comes with a price." She smiled through her tears, her heart finally at peace. "I would pay any price to be with you, Kaelen. There is no sacrifice too great for the love we share." And in that moment, as they stood together in the hall, surrounded by the remnants of a broken ceremony and a world that would never accept their union, Elira knew they had defied fate. Their love, though forbidden, had triumphed. But the future was uncertain. War still loomed, and the consequences of their defiance would not go unanswered. Yet as Kaelen pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that set her soul aflame, Elira knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them together.